Have you ever looked into an old photograph and felt that someone inside it was trying to speak to you? Not with words, but with their eyes pleading, warning, or perhaps remembering something the world has chosen to forget. In 1904, a family in Portland, Oregon, gathered in a studio to capture what was meant to be a simple portrait. 3 well-dressed children, a symbol of respectability and comfort. Yet more than a century later, that photograph would resurface and reveal a story no one was ever meant to uncover. It began with a boy named Thomas Whitmore, 12 years old, gentle, quiet, and loved at least by appearance. But when historians looked closely at his photograph, they noticed something unsettling. Something that did not belong in the face of a child. What they discovered would expose not only the secret tragedy of one family, but the darker truth that hid behind Portland's most privileged households. Tonight, let's drift into that image together, into the quiet smile that wasn't quite right, and listen for the story it has waited more than 100 years to tell. In a cluttered little antique shop tucked between the narrow streets of downtown Portland, Oregon, a discovery waited quietly in the dust. One that would haunt historian and collector Dr. Samuel Morrison for months. It happened on an ordinary grey afternoon. He had just purchased a small bundle of family photographs from an estate sale, most of them unremarkable, fading smiles. Familiar sepia tones, lives long folded into history. But among them, one image refused to be overlooked. It was a formal studio portrait mounted on thick cardboard, the kind so typical of the early 1900s. 3 children posed before an ornate Victorian backdrop. The inscription on the back, written in the elegant, careful script of another time, read, Dorothy 8, Thomas 12, Helen 6, Portland Studio, 1904. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a tender family keepsake. 2 young girls in pristine white lace dresses standing proudly beside their older brother. Their smiles were soft, unguarded, the kind one might expect from children indulging their parents' wish to capture a perfect moment. But Dr. Morrison lingered. His eyes, trained by decades of studying old photographs, saw something unsettled. The boy Thomas. His smile didn't match his eyes. There was a flicker there deep beneath the surface. Not sadness alone, but something closer to dread. His mouth formed the polite expected curve of joy, yet his gaze betrayed him. It was the look of someone trapped in a moment he wished to escape. And then there were his hands. Clenched tightly at his sides, small fists pressed against the fabric of his dark wool suit. An unusual pose, unnatural for a portrait, meant to show composure and grace. Dr. Morrison leaned closer beneath the lamplight that evening, studying every grain of the paper through his magnifying glass. The light fell across the children's faces, and though the girls glowed with warmth, Thomas seemed separate, as if he stood in another world entirely divided from his sisters by something unseen. He had examined thousands of photographs from this era, but few had ever affected him so deeply. The image held more than a family's likeness. It seemed to whisper of a secret sealed in emulsion and silver for more than a century. The photographer's embossed mark gleamed faintly in the corner, Hoffman and Associates. Fine portraiture, Portland, Oregon. The name struck a chord. Morrison knew of Hoffman's work, a respected studio that had operated in the city's golden years. But this image felt different. It wasn't just a portrait. It was a fragment of a story waiting to be remembered. The next morning, curiosity overtook him. Morrison began to dig into the city archives, chasing the faint trail of Hoffman and Associates. What he found was a portrait of Portland itself, a city alive with promise between 1898 and 1912, when fortune seekers from across the nation poured into its streets. Heinrich Hoffmann, a German immigrant, had founded his studio during this very boom. He had earned a reputation for elegance, for the subtle charm that coaxed even the shyest child into a smile. But when Morrison compared this photograph to others in the Hoffman collection, the difference was unmistakable. At the Portland Historical Society, the elderly archivist Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a woman who had handled the Hoffman collection for over 30 years, held the photograph carefully in her trembling hands. "I've seen thousands of his portraits," she murmured, adjusting her glasses. "He was a master of calm of poise. But this one," she paused, her eyes fixed on the boy. "This one feels wrong." Hoffman could always make children smile. Whatever troubled this boy, it was stronger than Hoffman's art could hide. Her words lingered in the quiet reading room, the faint ticking of the wall clock the only sound between them. Morrison sat back, feeling that familiar chill, the one that comes when history refuses to stay still. The year 1904, Mrs. Vance reminded him, had been a remarkable one in Portland. The city was preparing for the Great Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, an event meant to celebrate progress and prosperity. Families like the one in the photograph would have wanted to show their success, their refinement, their happiness. And yet, this portrait told another story. Why did Thomas's suit show faint signs of wear when the girl's dresses gleamed like new? Why was he the only one without a locket, without even a trace of ornament to mark his belonging? And most of all, what sorrow hid behind that too-perfect smile? When Morrison finally unearthed Hoffman's meticulous session logs, handwritten notes that detailed his sittings, his subjects, and even their moods, he knew he might be closer to the truth. But what he was about to uncover would take him far beyond the quiet halls of the archive and deep into the shadows that linger behind one forgotten photograph. The next clue came not from intuition but from ink and paper, the kind that carries the breath of another century. Within the Oregon Historical Society's quiet archives, Dr. Morrison found himself surrounded by rows of old, leather-bound ledgers, each one filled with the looping, careful handwriting of the long gone. These were the studio logbooks of Hoffman and Associates, and somewhere among their yellowed pages, the truth about the haunting portrait might be waiting. For days he searched, eyes aching fingers, blackened faintly with dust, until finally he found it. The entry dated September 15th, 1904. It read in Hoffman's elegant script, "Whitmore children. Dorothy Thomas Helen. Father's request. Special circumstances. Payment in advance. Boy, reluctant throughout session. Unusual family dynamics observed." The words stopped Morrison cold. That one phrase, special circumstances, carried a weight of implication. And the note that the boy was reluctant throughout the session suggested something more than simple restlessness. Hoffman, meticulous and discreet, would never have written such an observation unless it mattered. And so the surname Whitmore became the key that turned the lock. Morrison soon realized this was no anonymous family portrait. It was a record, a small, fragile window into the private world of a very real Portland family captured in the precise moment when their public success and private sorrows seemed to collide. The city directories of 1904 listed 3 families named Whitmore, but only one matched the ages of the children in the photograph. Charles Whitmore, timber merchant, his wife Catherine, children Thomas, Dorothy, and Helen. The Whitmores were not just another family in Portland society, they were among its brightest stars. Charles had arrived from Maine in 1887, chasing the fortunes promised by Oregon's vast timberlands. Within 15 years, he had built a lumber empire, 3 sawmills, over 200 employees, and lucrative contracts with the Southern Pacific Railroad. His name had become synonymous with ambition, wealth, and progress. The family lived high on Nob Hill in a 10-bedroom Victorian mansion surrounded by sculpted gardens and tended by a staff of 6. In those years, their name appeared constantly in the Portland Oregonian's society pages. Catherine was praised as one of our city's most gracious hostesses. Her gatherings described in flowing detail silver tea services, music drifting through the halls, politicians and businessmen mingling beneath crystal chandeliers. To the public, the Whitmores embodied the American ideal: industrious, charitable, enviably refined. But the photograph told a different story. Thomas's expression, frozen in that single instant of time, contradicted everything printed in the newspapers. Whatever had happened inside that studio in September 1904 was not celebration but endurance. His clenched hands, his guarded eyes, they whispered of something unseen, something wrong. And as Morrison pieced through the record of that year, a pattern began to take shape. 1904 had been pivotal for the Whitmores. Charles's company had secured several lucrative contracts tied to the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, which would soon flood Portland with tourists and opportunity. The family's social appearances multiplied, their name appearing weekly in the press. Catherine hosted charity luncheons and galas. Charles delivered speeches on progress and prosperity. Their success, it seemed, was reaching its height. Yet, beneath that glittering surface, something darker stirred. A clipping from the Oregonian dated August 1904 caught Morrison's attention. It read, "Young Thomas Whitmore, son of timber magnate Charles Whitmore, appeared notably withdrawn at yesterday's charity picnic. While his sisters delighted guests with their spirited participation in games, the boy remained close to his governess throughout the afternoon." Such a small detail one easily overlooked, yet it aligned perfectly with the look in the boy's eyes in the photograph. Why would a 12-year-old surrounded by comfort and privilege seem so haunted? Morrison began to suspect that the Whitmore's story, like so many families of that gilded age, had 2 faces, one for society and one hidden behind heavy curtains and closed doors. To understand Thomas, he would have to go beyond newspaper clippings and business ledgers into the spaces where childhood left its faintest marks. His next destination was Portland Academy, the elite private school where the Whitmore children had been educated. The institution's archives, preserved in the basement of what is now Lincoln High School, still held student ledgers from the early 1900s pages that smelled of chalk dust and linseed oil, the scent of another lifetime. There, among hundreds of fading names, Morrison found them: Dorothy, Helen, and Thomas. The school's enrollment confirmed the family's status they had attended, together their records meticulously kept. But what he read next sent a faint chill through him. Thomas's academic file showed a boy in quiet decline. His grades, excellent through his first years, began to falter early in 1904, the same year of the photograph. The handwriting of his teachers told a story all its own. From March 1904, the mathematics instructor wrote, "Thomas has become increasingly withdrawn and defiant. His attention wanders constantly. He appears not to have slept well. When questioned, he grows defensive, even hostile." And in another report, the English teacher's note was even more troubling. The English teacher's notes were brief, but devastating. "The boy's essays have taken a dark turn," she wrote. "His recent compositions about family life contain troubling themes of imprisonment and escape. I have requested a meeting with his parents to discuss these concerning developments." But when Dr. Morrison searched the school's correspondence files, he found no record that such a meeting ever occurred. Instead, there was only a single curt letter written on the crisp letterhead of Whitmore Timber Company and signed in Charles Whitmore's bold, unbending hand. "Thomas is experiencing temporary difficulties adjusting to increased family responsibilities," the father had written. "We request that the school exercise patience during this transitional period. No warmth, no concern. Just the measured tone of a man managing a business inconvenience." In the headmaster's personal files, Morrison discovered something even more telling. A private assessment penned by Dr. Edwin Hartwell, dated June 1904. "Young Whitmore's behavior has become increasingly erratic. He arrives at school appearing exhausted and often bears minor injuries which he attributes to accidents. His sisters seem unaware of his distress, suggesting the family dynamics are more complex than they appear publicly." The ink had faded to brown, but the words still carried weight, the weight of something ignored. And then came a smaller note, a quiet clue almost lost in the margins. "Ali expressed concern about young Whitmore's situation at home," Hartwell had written. "Claims the boy has made disturbing statements about his father's expectations. I have decided against pursuing this matter further, given the family's prominent position in our community." Ali, that name appeared nowhere else in the school's records. But Morrison traced it to an elderly groundskeeper, Patrick Ali, who had tended the Portland Academy grounds for over 20 years. Known amongst students for his kindness, he often served as a quiet confidant to troubled children. It seemed Thomas had sought him out during his lunch hours, perhaps hoping that anyone might listen. But even those small attempts at help had vanished into silence. Reputation, it seemed, had outweighed compassion. The photograph, Morrison realized, no longer captured a moment of mere sadness, it recorded isolation. A child surrounded by adults too fearful or complacent to intervene, and in that, the story stretched far beyond the Whitmores. It spoke to the wider truths of early 1900s Portland, an era when wealth shielded families from scrutiny, and when appearances mattered more than the quiet suffering within their walls. Still, one question burned in Morrison's mind. What had truly happened in that house? The next turn in his search came by chance. Hidden within the Portland City Archives, among the immigration records, he found a list of registered household staff for the Whitmore residence in 1904. There, in faded type, appeared the name Mary O'Sullivan, age 29, an Irish immigrant listed as governess. Morrison's pulse quickened. Through months of patient genealogical tracing, He finally located her descendant, Patricia Sullivan Hayes, Mary's great-granddaughter living quietly in Beaverton. At 84, Patricia carried her ancestors' soft Irish lilt, and as Morrison would soon learn something far more precious, Mary's personal journals and letters. She never spoke much about her time with wealthy families. Patricia explained gently as they sat together in her modest living room, surrounded by ticking clocks and fading photographs. But she kept everything, and she mentioned the Whitmore children often, especially the boy. The journals were written in neat, deliberate script words that trembled only slightly with age. And through them, the Whitmore mansion began to take form in Morrison's imagination. A grand home filled with glittering visitors, but empty of tenderness. Mary's entries from 1904 painted a chilling picture, one where discipline replaced affection and appearance mattered more than comfort. "Poor young Thomas grows thinner each week," she wrote that July. "Master Charles has increased his character-building exercises, requiring the boy to spend hours in the basement, practicing discipline and obedience. The child emerges pale and shaking, yet dares not speak of what transpires below." Morrison read the words twice, then a third time, his breath catching at their restrained horror. As the months progressed, Mary's tone darkened further. She described Charles Whitmore as a man consumed by control and reputation, who sees his children not as individuals, but as extensions of his business empire. Thomas, the only son and heir, bore the brunt of his father's education. "Master Charles speaks often of preparing Thomas for manhood," she wrote in August 1904. "Yet his methods are harsh beyond reason. The boy has developed a stutter and wakes screaming from nightmares. When I suggested he might benefit from a physician's care, the master accused me of feminine weakness and threatened my position. It was a household ruled not by love, but by fear." And then came the entry that froze Morrison where he sat. The one written just before the photograph was taken. Master Charles announced that the family would have formal portraits made to commemorate their success. Thomas begged to be excused, saying he felt unwell. The master refused. "You will smile and represent this family with pride," he commanded, "or face consequences worse than you can imagine." Mary's final words on that entry were brief, but they lingered long after Morrison closed the journal. The boy obeyed. But I fear that smile will haunt him, and perhaps, in time, all of us who stood by. The boy tried his best to smile for the camera. But if you look closely, really look, you can see it. That flicker of fear behind his small, strained expression. A child told to smile, though every part of him wanted to run. Who was he smiling for? And what would happen if that smile wasn't enough? Morrison could almost hear the shutter click now as he read the words written in the housekeeper's old letter. "I fear what Master Charles might do," she had written, "if the photographs do not meet his expectations of family perfection." Those few lines changed everything. Suddenly, the image that Morrison had once seen as simply odd, that forced smile, the tension in the boy's eyes became something else entirely. Thomas wasn't merely uncomfortable. He was performing happiness under command. A prisoner inside, a moment that would be preserved forever. Armed with these revelations from Mario Sullivan, Morrison's investigation deepened. He began searching for medical records traces of Thomas's physical condition, that might confirm what his eyes already told him. In 1904, Portland's medical world was small, almost intimate. Most of the city's wealthy families shared the same doctors, the same discretion. Among them, Dr. James Whitman stood out, a respected pediatrician known across Portland's elite neighborhoods. His practice records, preserved in the archives of the Oregon Health and Science University, became Morrison's next destination. Inside those folders, neatly handwritten in fading ink, lay the story of 3 children, Dorothy Helen and Thomas Whitmore. Dorothy and Helen's files were ordinary notes of mild fevers, the usual childhood ailments. But Thomas's were different. From early 1904 onward, the boy's file began to darken. March 12, 1904. Thomas Whitmore presents with chronic fatigue, recurring nightmares, and what appear to be stress-related stomach ailments. Dr. Whitman's pen paused before adding another line. Mother attributes symptoms to growing pains, but child exhibits signs of severe anxiety. Multiple bruises observed on torso, explained as rough play by father. The doctor's tone changed in the months that followed. His notes grew longer, more detailed, and more uneasy. Thomas was losing weight. He couldn't sleep. His speech began to falter, and when his father entered the examination room, the boy's entire body tensed. April 20th, 1904. Child becomes visibly agitated when father enters. Attempted to describe games, father plays interrupted by Mr. Whitmore, who insists such details are irrelevant. Strongly suspect emotional trauma, but family's influence makes direct intervention inadvisable. Even doctors in that era treaded carefully around the powerful. Their hands were often tied by unspoken rules, by fear of reputation, by wealth, by silence. Through that spring and summer, Dr. Whitman documented a pattern he could not officially name. Each entry more desperate than the last. August 1904. Boy presents with fresh injuries to back and shoulders. Father claims child fell from horse, but wounds inconsistent with riding accident. Thomas remains silent throughout examination. Fear for this child's safety continues to grow. By then, the doctor had tried quiet interventions. He suggested Thomas visit relatives or perhaps enroll in a boarding school, a subtle way of getting him away from home. But Charles Whitmore refused, coldly insisting his son needed discipline under his own supervision. The final note in Thomas's file, dated September 10th, 1904, just 5 days before the photograph was taken, carried a dreadful calm. Child appears to have resigned himself to his circumstances. Previous agitation replaced by disturbing calm. This withdrawal may indicate severe psychological damage. Have exhausted all diplomatically possible interventions. That was the last the doctor ever wrote about Thomas. But tucked at the back of the file, Morrison found something else. Something that made him stop breathing for a moment. A letter. Unsent. Addressed to the Portland Child Welfare Authorities. In it, Dr. Whitman had described his fears for Thomas's well-being, pleading for an investigation into the Whitmore home. But the letter was never mailed. Perhaps fear stopped him. Perhaps influence did. Or perhaps someone made sure it never left his desk. Morrison stared at the fragile paper. The ink faded, but the dread still alive within it. And yet, he felt the pull of another question forming. If the doctor had seen and written all this, what had the neighbors seen? Who else living near that Grand Nob Hill home might have witnessed what went on behind its walls and chosen, like Dr. Whitman, to remain silent? The Whitmore mansion once stood among Portland's proudest homes, a hilltop enclave of wealth and polished manners, where every neighbor knew every other, and no one ever looked too closely. Through careful genealogical research, Morrison traced a surviving witness, Eleanor Hartwell, daughter of the family, who had lived next door. Now, 91, she resided quietly in an assisted living home on Portland's west side, still lucid, still remembering. "Oh, I remember the Whitmore children very well," she said softly, her eyes brightening when Morrison showed her the photograph. "Dorothy and Helen were such sweet girls. We used to play together in the gardens between our houses." She paused, studying the boy's face in the faded image. "But Thomas." Her voice trembled. "That poor child." We all knew something was terribly wrong next door. For the first time, Morrison was hearing the Whitmore story, not from letters or files, but from the mouth of someone who had seen. Eleanor's recollections unfolded like fragile glass, every detail trembling with memory. From her bedroom window, she could see part of the Whitmore backyard. On quiet evenings, sounds carried across the hedges. Thomas was often outside before dawn, she said, or long after dark. It wasn't normal for a boy his age. Sometimes I'd hear him crying, and sometimes shouting. Always Mr. Whitmore's voice, never the children's. The worst memories came from what she called the basement. Her window overlooked its small barred openings, and through them, strange lights glowed at night. "There were always lights down there," she whispered, sometimes flickering, sometimes steady. My father once mentioned hearing what he called disciplinary sessions, but he told Mother it wasn't our place to interfere with another man's household. That was how people thought in those days. You didn't interfere. Her most haunting memory came from one summer night in 1904. She had been awakened by muffled sounds, soft, desperate. Looking across the yard, she saw Thomas at his upstairs window, his small hands pressed against the glass. He was looking straight toward our house, she said, tears welling. I was only 8, but I knew that look. He was asking for help. She ran to wake her parents. By the time her mother came, Thomas was gone from the window. Her father, Dr. Edwin Hartwell, a man of reason and standing, had seen the distress too. But like so many others, he felt powerless to act powerless against a family. Like the Whitmores, whose money and influence insulated them from scrutiny. Eleanor's voice trembled as she looked once more at the photograph. I can see it now, she whispered. Everything we should have seen then. That smile. It isn't joy. It's a plea. Her words confirmed what Morrison had already begun to suspect. The Whitmore family portrait was not just a record of private suffering, it was evidence of a collective failure. A child's pain preserved on glass, while an entire neighborhood chose silence. Morrison turned next to the public record tracing what had become of Thomas after that ill-fated photograph. Portland's archives offered few clues, only one small notice that felt like a whisper of finality. November 18th, 1904. The Portland Oregonian carried a short obituary. Thomas Whitmore, age 12. Beloved son of timber merchant Charles Whitmore, and wife Catherine died Tuesday following a brief illness. Services to be held privately. The family requests no flowers or condolences. A few lines. nothing more. But the official death certificate filed in Multnomah County revealed details that unsettled Morrison. The listed cause, pneumonia, complicated by nervous exhaustion. The signature, Dr. James Whitman, the same physician who had once written so anxiously of the boy's injuries. Yet something about the document was wrong. Whitman's handwriting, usually meticulous, was shaky. Several corrections marked the page. It looked hesitant. When Morrison compared those entries to other cases from the same year, the differences were striking. Whitman had signed hundreds of certificates in his career. Only this one bore visible tremors. Further digging uncovered murmurs, private doubts that had circulated quietly among Portland's upper class. A few servants, a tutor, perhaps even a clergyman had questioned the circumstances of Thomas's death. But no inquiry had ever followed. In 1904, the suffering of a child in a wealthy household could vanish without consequence. The most vivid record of Thomas's final days came once again from Mary O'Sullivan, the family governess. In her journal, she chronicled the boy's decline in the weeks after the photograph was taken. Master Charles was displeased with Thomas's appearance in the portraits she wrote, and increased his corrective measures. The boy refused food. He barely spoke even to his sisters. I begged Mistress Catherine to intervene, but she insisted it was a phase that boys must be broken of weakness. Then her final entries. Each one slower, heavier. November 15th, 1904. Found Thomas collapsed in his room, burning with fever. He kept whispering, "I can't do it anymore, Mary. I just can't." Dr. Whitman was summoned, but he spent more time speaking privately with Master Charles than tending to the child. November 17th. Thomas passed peacefully in his sleep. Dr. Whitman says his heart gave out. But I know the truth. His heart was broken long before his body failed. Mary wrote that Master Charles showed no sorrow, only irritation, worried about how the event might affect his business relationships. Her account suggested what no report ever stated outright: Thomas Whitmore had not died of illness, but of despair. His pneumonia was real, perhaps, but his spirit had already been crushed beyond recovery. Dr. Whitman's final medical notes hinted at the same truth cloaked in clinical restraint. Child's immune system compromised by chronic stress. Physical symptoms secondary to severe emotional disturbance. Fear that intervention came too late to prevent systemic collapse. And indeed it had. By the time anyone considered that something might be wrong, the boy's voice had fallen silent forever. Even decades later, Morrison found whispers, fragments of regret scattered through letters and recollections. Servants who had seen bruises but told no one. Neighbors who had heard cries but closed their windows. A city that had chosen decorum over conscience. And in the center of it all, one photograph, a single frozen smile holding the memory of a child no one saved. Among those who still remembered, whispers persisted long after the Whitmore name had faded from Portland's newspapers. The school's old groundskeeper, Patrick O'Malley, had reportedly told a colleague years later that the boy hadn't died of pneumonia at all. He died, O'Malley said quietly, of a broken spirit. Even Dr. James Whitman, who had signed the death certificate, carried that burden for the rest of his life. In a letter to a fellow physician, he wrote that Thomas's death represented the failure of an entire community. not just one family. But the Whitmores' influence, as always, silenced every question. There would be no inquiry, no suspicion, no reckoning. The business prospered. The mansion glittered with evening receptions once more. And life on the surface went on. Dorothy and Helen grew into graceful young women, their lives carefully curated to mirror their parents' social perfection. They were never told the truth. The adults around them, relatives, teachers, neighbors, maintained a conspiracy of silence, sealing away the memory of the boy who had smiled too hard for the camera. For Morrison, piecing through these records a century later, that silence was more chilling than the cruelty itself. Because as he compared the Whitmore case to others from the same era, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern of wealthy families whose children suffered quietly, their pain protected by the same walls that displayed their portraits. By cross-referencing reports, letters, and early child welfare petitions, Morrison uncovered at least 6 other cases in Portland between 1900 and 1906. Each involved a child from privilege. Each ended in tragedy. And each had been quietly erased under the language of illness, fatigue, or accident. Yet something had begun to shift in the city's conscience. In 1905, just months after Thomas's death, a new organization appeared, the Portland Children's Aid Society. Its founders spoke cautiously of domestic welfare and youth protection, but Morrison found correspondence that revealed a deeper spark behind their mission. Among those letters was one from Dr. Whitman himself, dated December 1904. His words were restrained but resolute. We can no longer allow social position or economic influence to shield families from scrutiny when children's lives are at stake. The death of young Thomas Whitmore must serve as a catalyst for change, ensuring no other child suffers in silence behind the facade of respectability. Morrison lingered on that letter for a long time. It was the kind of sentence a man writes only once, when conscience finally outweighs fear. And it wasn't only Whitman who had changed. Mary O'Sullivan, the family's governess, who had once held Thomas as he whispered his last words, left domestic service entirely after his death. She dedicated her remaining years to children's protection societies across the Northwest. Her notes described early proposals for laws that would allow servants and teachers to report suspected abuse without fear of retaliation, ideas far ahead of their time. Even Whitman's later writings revealed the same moral urgency. He drafted proposals for mandatory reporting laws decades before they would become state policy in Oregon. In his private papers, he described the Whitmore case not just as a personal failure, but as evidence of a societal blindness, one that demanded systemic change. And then there was Eleanor Hartwell, the neighbor who had seen Thomas at the window that night. As an adult, she would become one of Portland's most respected advocates for children's rights, serving on multiple boards and speaking publicly about the need for community vigilance. It seemed the boy's quiet suffering had echoed through the lives of those who had witnessed it, shaping their paths, their choices, their convictions. But there was one more thread, one image that bound all of it together. The photograph. Dr. Whitman had kept a copy for himself, not as a memento but as a reminder. He sometimes showed it discreetly to legislators and reformers, a small faded print of a family arranged in perfect symmetry. At first glance it looked ordinary, but then the eyes would find the boy, his smile trembling just slightly, and they would feel it the unease, the silent plea. Whitman called it a portrait of institutional failure. And soon, among early child welfare reformers, that photograph became almost legendary. Copies circulated quietly between offices and meeting halls, a symbol of the pain hidden behind polished facades. It hung in the background of speeches, folded inside letters, placed discreetly in drawers. Not as a relic of tragedy, but as proof that suffering could wear the mask of perfection, and that indifference could be just as deadly as cruelty. For Morrison, who had spent years reconstructing this story, the photograph came to represent something far larger than one boy's death. It captured an entire moment in history, the instant when silence began to break. Thomas Whitmore's story was not erased. It endured through reformers who spoke his name, in meetings, through policies written in the shadows of his pain, and through the quiet awakening of a city that could no longer look away. In the end, Morrison wrote, a single photograph preserved not just an image, but a truth. The suffering of one child forced a community to confront itself, to build from guilt and grief the beginnings of compassion. And perhaps that is what remains most haunting about the Whitmore portrait. Not simply what it shows, but everything it remembers. The 1904 studio portrait of the Whitmore children had long ceased to be just a family keepsake. It had become something else, something weightier. A silent record of privilege pain and the unseen cost of appearances. A single image that carried within it the quiet testimony of a child who had suffered unseen. When Dr. Morrison presented his findings to the Portland Historical Society, the room fell into a kind of reverent stillness. He spoke not of scandal or accusation, but of silence. How Thomas's forced smile had become a fragile bridge between truth and concealment. In that photograph, a 12-year-old boy performed happiness, his expression frozen by expectation, while behind his eyes lived a story too dangerous for him to ever tell aloud. This image, Morrison said softly, teaches us to look beyond what we are meant to see. The smile seems warm, even innocent, until one lingers upon the eyes. The joy fades, and something else, resignation, perhaps fear, emerges like a ghost beneath glass. It reminds us that children in distress can live among us, hidden in plain sight. Their pain disguised by a family's reputation or society's polite indifference. The photograph, Morrison continued, had become more than evidence. It was an indictment, a quiet revelation of how schools, doctors, neighbors, and even the camera itself had all failed one boy. Yet from that failure, something extraordinary had begun to grow. The very people who once stood powerless, Maria Sullivan, the family's governess, Dr. Whitman, who had tried to intervene, even the neighbor child, Eleanor Hartwell, all carried the weight of Thomas's story into their adult lives. Each became, in their own way, a guardian of children's voices. Maria abandoned domestic service and devoted her life to early childhood protection. Dr. Whitman drafted legislative proposals decades ahead of his time. And young Eleanor, once haunted by the sight of Thomas's quiet suffering, grew into one of Portland's most passionate advocates for children's rights. Morrison's research revealed that the 1904 photograph had quietly traveled through reform circles, passed from one advocate's desk to another, a hidden emblem of conscience. Copies were found in the offices of the Portland Children's Aid Society, where social workers studied Thomas's expression as a lesson, that pain could wear the face of obedience and that a smile could conceal an emergency. Soon the image began appearing in training materials for teachers and physicians used to remind them that children's suffering often hides beneath the surface. In those early years, the photograph became a tool of transformation proof that empathy once awakened could be taught, and indeed it worked. By the 1920s, Oregon would develop some of the nation's most progressive child protection laws. Mandatory reporting of abuse, an idea Dr. Whitman had once fought for alone, finally became law. His efforts and the haunting power of Thomas's image had shaped a new way of seeing childhood itself. The photograph's influence reached far beyond Portland. Dr. Whitman, before his passing, had carried it with him to medical conferences across the Pacific Northwest. There he used it to show other doctors what the body cannot always tell: the silent wounds of psychological trauma. For the first time, physicians were asked not only to treat illness, but to read emotion. Soon after, the image found its way into early medical textbooks, its caption, simple yet chilling, signs of chronic distress in the child. And in the years that followed, scholars would look back and see that Thomas's photograph had quietly helped spark an entire field, what we now call child psychology. Through one boy's captured expression, generations began to learn that children's minds carry stories as urgent as their bodies. Even the art of photography was changed by it. Henrik Hoffman and others who worked in portrait studios at the time began keeping quiet notes on families who seemed troubled. Some when their suspicions grew too dark to ignore quietly alerted authorities. What had once been a business of smiles had become for a few an act of protection. By the time Morrison completed his research, he realized that the photograph's truest legacy was not just historical, it was human. It proved that an image could become a voice for those who were never allowed to speak. Today, Thomas Whitmore's portrait rests in the Portland Historical Society's permanent collection. It sits behind tempered glass, surrounded by Morrison's research, the letters of those who once knew him, and the silent testimonies of reformers who carried his story forward. Visitors stand before it for long minutes, drawn not by the charm of the photograph, but by something deeper, the uneasy feeling that the boy is still asking to be seen. Beside the display, a small placard lists modern child protection resources. The past, it seems, still reaches toward the present, whispering its reminders. In the final lines of his report, Morrison wrote words that have since been etched in brass beside the photograph. This image reminds us that every child's suffering matters, no matter how powerful their family may be. True protection requires courage from doctors, from neighbors, from all of us to see what others refuse to see. And perhaps that is what keeps Thomas's story alive. His smile, once mistaken for joy, has become something else entirely. A quiet warning, a promise that even behind the most polished facades, truth waits for someone brave enough to look closely.